Hello, this is Mr. Smith again, and this is Honors Government 2, the Comparative Government Unit, looking at Roman Republicanism in the second lecture. The Roman Republic, the most valued contribution of the Romans to the world, took place in the Republic itself, stretching out, of course, then later on into the Empire. The Romans had their own codified system of law known as the 12 Tables. The Roman legal system provided security for the Republic and later on the Empire. It provided for some amount of equality for citizens and even for non-citizens, the right to defense during a trial, the right to be considered innocent to proven guilty, although of course their trial system was a bit more chaotic than what we would have here today in the modern world. The Roman legal system inspired legal principles still practiced around the world today. And of course, as you can see by the territory, it was quite expansive, covering a great portion of the Mediterranean region, reaching into Northern Europe and also the Middle East. Rome is located, of course, in the peninsula of Italy. The Mediterranean Sea provides transportation and food and helped create a great amount of trade for the city of Rome. Italy provided fertile lands and river valleys for food and easy communication. And of course, the mountains provided some amount of protection for invaders. The Roman city-state, of course, would eventually grow to dominate the entire Italian peninsula, creating the republic that we know about today. Romans were polytheistic, believing in many gods and spirits. They, of course, took in a lot of culture from other civilizations in the area, including the Greeks, because much of their knowledge of the gods came from the Greeks, albeit with a number of name changes. All of these superstitions and gods and mythological stories ended up transferring over to Roman culture. This is known as cultural diffusion. For instance, the Greek god Zeus became the almighty Roman god Jupiter. The Greek goddess Hera became the Roman goddess Juno. This made them incredibly tolerant, despite the fact that they still looked down often toward other people as barbaric. They didn't allow, of course, this diffusion to happen, and it allowed them to relate to more and different peoples throughout the Mediterranean region. The basics of the Republic. Rome was founded around about 509 BC. Romans founded a new type of government called a republic. In a republic, people chose officials to represent them. So this is a type of what we also call representative democracy. The highest form of government in Rome was the Senate, a body of people that included the wealthiest landowners, usually from a sect of older men. Many of these people, especially in the beginning, were patricians. They were nobles, part of the aristocracy, as opposed to the plebeian, which were the commoners. And so, just like Athens before it, originally a long time ago, the Roman system started off as a monarchy, then got taken over by an oligarchy, the aristocrats known as patricians, who established a government system, a representative government to help spread out power, so that no one person became too powerful. But it was still vested in a patrician-controlled system through bodies like the Senate. The most prominent of the executive branch, of course, would be the two councils. The senators elected the council, spelled as you see there, CONSULS, whose job it was to run the government and command the army. One council sat in office presiding over the Senate, kind of like a ruling chair, while the other was the commander-in-chief of the military. These two councils held one-year terms, and there was two of them at the same time to make sure that no one person became too powerful or tyrannical. Numerous other offices existed throughout the empire, including elected officials that monitored the games and feasts, others in charge of the treasury, others in charge of the religious system that worked in coordination with the stories about Roman gods and mythology. And so there were a number of different elected executives, but the councils would be the most powerful. Upper-class Romans known as patricians held most of the power for the early part of the Republic. They held nearly all the important political offices, and it was only through tension that I'll mention here in a little bit that eventually caused the plebeian to increase in the amount of power that they had. As time grew by and trade increased, of course, it meant that the patricians weren't the only ones with power. Plebeian families who grew their businesses started to see an increase in wealth and power as well, which is why there was a lot of pressure to increase representation amongst the commoners. Common farmers, artisans, and merchants, all known as plebeians, for a long time were kept out of the power system. These two classes were based on birth alone, and the line between these two classes was extremely rigid, even though, as I mentioned before, some plebeians, especially if they had prosperous businesses, were able to increase in wealth. Both patricians and plebeians led double lives as farmers and soldiers because of the constant threat of war. All male citizens were required to serve in the army, and no one could hold public office until he served 10 years as a soldier. Massive military units were called legions, which consisted of, for instance, 4,000 to 6,000 heavily armed infantry soldiers, cavalry, smaller groups of people on horseback that assisted the infantry, and each legion was divided into 50 smaller groups called a century. This military helped them, of course, expand across the peninsula of Italy, incorporating more city-states and kingdoms, but eventually coming into conflict with other large kingdoms or empires in the Mediterranean region, most notably Carthage. There you can see that Rome and Carthage at the beginning of the Second Punic War in 218 BC. So they actually competed in multiple situations of conflict. By 270 BC, Rome had conquered all of Italy. They went on to control North Africa, Greece, and parts of Asia Minor. But the expansion also led to much corruption. After they, of course, defeated Carthage, they ended up inheriting a lot of land and slaves and wealth, which of course flooded back to Rome, but mostly lined the pockets of patricians or in some cases even wealthier plebeians. But despite all this, of course, nothing seemed to change. Economic distress seemed to grow as more and more jobs of Romans were taken by slaves, and the common people started to cry out for reform in the system, especially since they had little or no say in government issues. The Gracchi brothers and their followers, commonly known as the Gracchi, pressed for some of these reforms to include plebeians more in the decision-making process, to allow them to have some of their own legislative bodies and executive offices that they alone could hold, but also open up some of the patrician offices for them to run in as well. This, of course, was a successful reform, but only after some violence. The patricians actually had the brothers and a number of their followers killed. But sensing that this wasn't going to get rid of the problem permanently, eventually the patricians started to give in to some of the demands of the remaining Gracchi. One of the results, of course, was the slave revolt led by legendary Spartacus. The revolt eventually incorporated tens of thousands of slaves, many, of course, protesting against the terrible conditions in which they had to live, sometimes, of course, being used for entertainment, being taken advantage of sexually, for hard manual labor, and, of course, being severely punished if ever out of line. Spartacus, who many believe had at least some previous military experience, was able to raise up such a large army and defeat the Romans at first, but eventually, of course, this started to fade as their army grew. Some of the slaves started to divide into factions, and eventually their unity faded. Because of this, eventually a man by the name of Crassus, one of the wealthiest military generals in Rome, was able to seize the opportunity and defeat Spartacus in battle. This was a sign, of course, that the military was needed more and more, not just to expand their borders, but also maintain order within the Roman system. And Crassus was not the only general who was becoming ambitious. Another was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar had become a military general and helped conquer what is now modern-day Spain, for instance, reaping, of course, the rewards of slaves and also material wealth. He was a lower noble, but believed that the power would come from the plebeians, so he often sent back a lot of tributes to the commoners in Rome to gain their favor. Caesar also hoped to reform government, founded libraries, and planned public work projects because he believed this would keep the minds and the hands of the people busy, but also provide them with a better standard of living. Julius Caesar, of course, was not the only powerful military general. Another one would be Pompey. Pompey helped defeat, for instance, pirates in the Mediterranean. And because the three of them were so ambitious, Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey, they decided to form the first triumvirate. This would be an agreement of the three to equally hold power, and at once, for instance, two of them would be consuls, Julius Caesar and Pompey. Crassus was eventually killed in battle, his enemies punishing him for his greed by pouring liquid hot gold down his throat. What kept Pompey and Crassus at peace was the fact that what kept Pompey and Caesar at peace, was that Julius Caesar's daughter Julia ended up marrying Pompey. And she eventually died in childbirth, though, and Julius Caesar and his army had grown restless after conquering numerous foreign territories and decided to, of course, look into taking the next steps in securing power. Rumors started to spread wildly through Rome. Eventually, of course, the Senate demanded that Julius Caesar return by himself to answer for why he had not disbanded his armies or reported back. And Julius Caesar, of course, obliges by returning, but he doesn't return alone. He brings his army with him, illegally crossing the Rubicon River closer to Roman territory. This, of course, causes Pompey to flee, and he himself raises an army and fights a number of battles with them, but eventually is outfoxed, eventually fleeing to Egypt, where there the royal family decides it is probably not a good idea to take in Pompey, and so they ended up assassinating him. Caesar follows eventually to Egypt, assists Cleopatra to overthrow her brother and husband, Ptolemy, and lets her become the ruler, albeit a vassal or just representative of Rome, on the throne of Egypt. Julius Caesar reportedly has a child with her, but then goes back to Italy to rule over. And of course, because of his military, because Pompey has been defeated, Crassus isn't around anymore. Eventually, the Senate gives in to him and decides to declare him a consul and then eventually dictator. But dictator at the time was meant to be someone in charge during emergency times, and supposedly because of all this chaos, it was necessary to have one person in charge. And this, of course, was set with a time limit, then that was extended and extended, eventually made for life. And so many people started to worry that Caesar was becoming like a king. And the people were enthralled with him because of all the gifts they had given him, because of all the reforms that they had promised, because they treated him differently than other patricians had. And so the senators, particularly those of the patrician class, were incredibly worried that Caesar was becoming more and more like a king. And so, while he was on the Senate floor in 44 BC, a group of Roman aristocrats, senators themselves, decided that they did not want a dictator anymore, and so they decided to stab him to death. Once the assassination takes place, of course, there are a large amount of people that are upset. It's Julius Caesar's supporters, but also Mark Antony, who was a very good friend of Julius Caesar and also supporting general. And because of this uproar that happens, two of the assassins, in particular Brutus and Cassius, end up fleeing Rome, although eventually forming their own military. In the meantime, Julius Caesar's adopted son and grandnephew, whose name was Octavian, but he changes it to Augustus, inherits most of Caesar's wealth, and he distributes a lot of this, like his grand uncle would have done, to the masses. And of course, that means that they are partially committed to Octavian, but also still Mark Antony, because he had been a friend and fellow general of Caesar. Octavian, in the meantime, also secures a position in the military, and he rises through the ranks, although mostly taking advantage of other people's military successes. And so he becomes a big name equal to that of Mark Antony. Another general is involved when these two have a falling out to try to come up with some type of solution called Lepidus. But in the end, all three of them end up agreeing to actually hold power together in the second triumvirate. Lepidus, of course, is put off to the far reaches of what is still called the Republic at this point, and really Mark Antony and Octavian, who eventually once again is called Augustus, end up enjoying the power and the money that goes along with it. But their falling out continues to happen. Mark Antony eventually goes to Egypt, where he, just like Julius Caesar, falls in love with Cleopatra. They have a number of children together, and he basically pledges himself to the Egyptian people. And this, of course, is taken as a great offense. Even though the Romans are somewhat tolerant because of this cultural diffusion, once again, they still look at other people as barbaric, so they look at that as a betrayal. So eventually, Octavian looks at this as a situation to call up the Roman people on his behalf and destroy Mark Antony and Cleopatra, which they do so in battle, and the two eventually retreat to Egypt, where they both take their own lives. So Octavian, who becomes Augustus, is now the last remaining person of power. And this sets up a situation where he is able to establish himself as first citizen, which he basically makes up to make himself look modest. But in reality, he's an emperor, and he has complete and total control with all this wealth and all this power, all this military might, and the support of the people. The Senate obviously isn't going to be able to do anything about it. And so they aren't going to be able to take that power at any point soon. At first, Augustus, of course, sets up a brilliant system where he handpicks a successor, which will be able to continue his progress and reforms that he took upon himself from Julius Caesar. And it does last for a few emperors. They have a little bit of a golden age, but eventually they get into a situation where they have a lot of bitter rivalries, people killing each other to gain the position of emperor, which becomes known as Caesar, including family members turning on each other and so on. So eventually the Republic fades, but a lot of its bits and pieces are still there. There's still senates, there's still councils, there's still all these other positions, but basically they all bow to the power of the Caesar or emperor. So when did the Republic really end? Well, that's a good question. Of course, many people would say it's ended with Octavian finally seizing power, but some would say maybe it was Julius Caesar, because even though he was stabbed to death, the Senate getting back any type of influence was only temporary. But of course, they weren't the first military generals, Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey, to try to seize control. A couple generations before, Marius and Sulla were both generals that temporarily took over Rome and held their military power over the Senate. So there had been long-standing corruption within the military, especially amongst influential leaders who took advantage of the fact that they had these massive armies that Rome needed in order to protect themselves internally and externally. And these generals with this massive amount of loyal men, of course, were able to take over the Republic at any point in time. And so really, Julius Caesar was the first person temporarily to be successful at this, and then eventually transition his power, albeit with a brief temporary relapse in between, to Octavian, otherwise known as Augustus. So the Republic had checks and balances, but obviously not good enough to stop a military invasion or from the masses expanding the power of one of these incredibly famous and popular generals.